cool. So, hey, I've got Arti Harchaker with me today. I think I got that right.
Yeah, you got it right.
Good
It's
enough.
it was really good.
I've known Arti for a good minute or two now, and I really wanted to have you on here because you have this really cool and unique blog called Joyful Urbanist that I've found really fascinating. So I definitely want to talk about that, but there's other stuff
Yeah.
to talk about too. And I think as I have known you over the years, your career has really changed and
Yeah.
evolved a lot. I think we met when you were working in the bustling metropolis of Mesquite, Texas.
That's right. In 2007, if you can believe that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you were a planner basically on staff at that time. And so, why don't you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about your? I think you originally had a degree in architecture, if I remember right, from Notre Dame. And
Yeah.
how did you come to like the planning and architecture world? And then we'll kind of get into what you're doing now, which is a little different.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, so my undergraduate's from UT Austin, and I actually did that in urban studies. They didn't have planning, like planning was in the architecture school, but it was a master's program. So I actually started off like pre-pharmacy and stumbled into an upper level urban studies class, and I thought it was amazing. Um, so then, yeah, I started off as a public sector planner. During school, I had interned with the city of Austin, and then after that, I did that for about 3.5 years. So I started the city of Mesquite, which is where we met. I think you were teaching like an FBCI session in Fort Worth or something,
Yeah.
like blast from the past. And then Richard and I had brought you in for a project in Mesquite. Um, and then I went to Notre Dame and got a master's of city architecture and urban design. And I think I just really had this interest in understanding why. We were writing form-based codes. I was kind of following it, but didn't was trying to really understand what the standards meant, why people were making certain design decisions, and that's really what fueled my interest. And then I graduated and went back to Texas, was working for the city of Rowlett, helping them kind of get a form-based code across the finish line and then helping them with implementation, which was, that was actually quite challenging because you're doing a lot of like
Hmm.
internal convincing. Um, and then I went into the private sector. So have been doing, private sector work for 10 years from 2013 until now. Started off at Townscape, and the two principals were kind of retiring, so they had some projects, and then, when I was kind of building the pipeline, I basically had a decision to make to stay in Texas or to leave and go to San Francisco. And I took a job with Opticos and was there for a couple years, and then was with Alta Planning and Design, and around 2018 is when I started the blog for Joyful Urbanist. We can talk about that, but it was kind of after my time at Opticos. And then during my kind of tenure in that, I also taught at UC Berkeley for a couple of years. And now I'm a partner success manager in tech. So I've been doing that for 3 years, started in 2020, but really structured that because it's a degree removed from consulting, because I do want to practice consulting under Joyful Urbanist. And so, that's basically what I've been doing. And yeah, I mean, that's basically all of that in a,
That's the long and winding
yeah.
road, in
Yes.
like as close to a soundbite as you can give me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, exactly.
so I mean, going back to like when we were working in Mesquite, the
Hmm.
project we worked on back then with all of your colleagues, which actually was a really fun and interesting project. I mean, how would you? It was a form-based code project that we did, and we were looking at different ways to implement the idea of a form-based code citywide. How would you describe like what kind of community Mesquite is to somebody who doesn't
Yeah.
know it?
I mean, it's basically a first ring suburb of Dallas, but it's losing a lot of investment. I think at the time when we were working on that project, um, it wasn't as it wasn't as prevalent to have market studies tied to design work or to form-based codes. I feel like that was definitely very necessary for the type, just the where
Mhm.
it was, right? It wasn't really in a transitional area or an area where there's some patterns of walkability. It was in what they called the newly annexed area, and then really looking at a floating kind of code for the extraterritorial jurisdiction. And I think what you guys were testing was, basically like how to apply these principles if the code was brought down
Mhm.
within, certain areas, and, really talking about, what that means in terms of new town development. I believe at the time they did have development pressure where people were coming in to propose like subdivisions. And so we were trying to get away from leapfrog development and, suburban sprawl and really think of something that was more responsible. But at the same time, like I didn't really understand things like succession and evolution of cities. I was still fairly new into the
Mhm.
practice. And so, but yeah, I think we were at that time we were trying to do something more like a, a, a parallel option, and then we ended up adopting by right in the area that the city owned, and then basically, if a developer was asking for services from the city, then they had to develop under the form-based code instead of proposing a PD or something like that.
Mhm. And do you keep in touch with Jeff and some of the folks who were there at the time and track implementation of that, just out of
Yeah, I
curiosity?
mean, we've checked in a few times. I mean, obviously, I mean Richard,
Mhm.
I he and I were on the Senior North Texas board together
Yeah.
before I had moved out, and and Jeff, yeah, like I will see randomly see Jeff at like APA and stuff like that. And we'll always try to connect. I think, I mean, I know that they were having some. I mean, it's just that I think that the market study piece comes into play with that, right? In terms of having a lot of development opportunities in that particular area, they did use that parallel code to pull down in other kind of greenfield areas within the city, and I think that they also did it for, I believe, in another portion, like a corridor plan. And the codes that we did that were like internal to the city actually, did better.
Mhm.
And they were getting investment, but the city was also backing, investment, or they had applied for like regional grants to put in like the infrastructure. So there was some type of catalyst, and I don't think that in that particular area, the ETJ, there was a whole lot of catalyst. But and then I believe the other kind of greenfield area, they had gone through applying it, and they had gone through a charrette process, but I don't think it actually um, like developed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting deal at the time, I remember, and I should have mentioned we were actually working as a sub to Elizabeth Garvin, who, was just really, really fun, enjoyable to work with. She's a planner that's in the Denver area, but has a deep Kansas City connection, so that's how we got to know her.
Yeah.
But, it was fascinating because you had this first of all, you're in Texas, which a lot of people, may not think about, initially is like, "Oh, this is a suburb of Dallas. How is this, like, on the cutting edge?" But you guys
Yeah.
really were. I mean, you were really pushing the envelope but really trying to, balance that with a real rigor about what is marketable, what's doable, and
Hmm.
then how do you leverage investments that the city is gonna make itself anyway.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and especially I think the impetus for the form-based codes, or at least the rationale that we, took to council was we had when we first started, right? We had 4 neighborhood plans, and a lot of the implementation kind of strategies, and a lot of the kind of um, let's say like goals and objectives that the neighborhoods had, revolved around build form. And so randomly I had gone to a conference where Monty was presenting, and I like fell in love. And I was like, we need to do this.
Mm,
And so Richard was like, okay, I'll help you. I learned a lot from him because he has a law, degree. And I think that was really kind of instrumental in a lot of ways to understanding how to actually calibrate it based on
mhm,
state law and tie it to the neighborhood plans and the comprehensive plan. But I mean, that's where it had started. So like you were saying, the city wanted to invest in these neighborhoods, and it gave it a level of priority, where they actually could, and we could kind of concentrate those investments, but also help people see that, we were investing, or the city was investing by doing these rezonings as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting, we had a few trips down there and we worked on that for a while, but I think a lot of people don't realize if you're not in the middle of the country that really the whole Dallas Fort Worth area has been a pretty incredible laboratory for new urbanism and form-based codes and a lot of pretty forward-thinking planning ideas going on 20 years now. There's a pretty remarkable amount of experimentation that happened in suburban locations.
Hmm.
And I know Mesquite, I think, probably saw that, and you guys probably saw that, and you're like, how do we do some more of this here?
Yeah, I mean, it's also like, following the different firms that have been kind of working in the area. I think Gateway and Scott Polikoff had kind of really pushed the market studies, and then we started to kind of fold them in, right? So we were definitely watching, and I think and seeing what everybody was doing. I think my first CNU was at in Austin in 2006,
Hmm.
and I was really trying to figure out these answers, like how do you apply these concepts at a regional scale, right? So we were working at two different scales, and then understanding the neighborhood scale, but then how does it apply to corridors? And so yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot. Bill Giedema in the area
Hmm.
has done a lot of like new town development. So even seeing how to work with kind of mass production developers, and basically be able to introduce at least a range of sizes of housing types within a neighborhood.
Yeah. So then later on, you mentioned that you left Texas and went to San
Yeah,
Francisco. So
yeah,
did I remember right that you grew up in Texas? Were you from
yeah,
Texas? Yeah, that's what I thought.
yeah. I grew up in Texas, and then we were in San Francisco for 6 years, and then we moved back basically at the end of 2020.
Okay. So was it
Um,
was it work that took you to San Francisco, or just the opportunities out there?
Yeah, it was work. I mean, my husband was contracting with, I guess, Facebook at the time, Meta now, but
Hmm.
and so he was doing weekly travel, and
Yeah.
he did it for 6 months and was like, I can't do this anymore. And so I had to make a choice. And I think John Anderson in his latest kind of recording had talked about, just like learning how to build a pipeline, learning how to win projects. And I feel like I had finally figured that out. I had won two projects, and then I was like, oh man, I have to, and it was fine. Like, I still think San Francisco was the best decision for us, in terms of professional growth, but also a lot of personal growth
Hmm.
there. And so I think it was really good for us. Like, it was a something that really took us out of our comfort zones, and
Hmm.
forced us to really think about what we wanted to do for our lives to be like more purposeful,
Hmm.
and really kind of define that for ourselves. Um, but yeah, Chris Jansen, who was an associate at the time at Opticos and is now a principal at LRK,
Hmm.
he was leaving. He was actually working remotely in Dallas, and they were looking for an associate, and we just switched places, basically.
Yeah. Chris is a good guy. I've known him a long time too. So,
Hmm.
um, so, uh, so then we had I had Dan on here,
Yeah.
a few months ago, and Dan's certainly one of my favorite people, in
Mhm.
the whole new urbanism world. But so you worked at Opticos then for a little while before jumping out into the tech world. So talk a little bit about, so once you go to Opticos, are you doing project management and doing form-based codes basically at that point?
Yeah, so it's interesting, when I was kind of interviewing and talking to Karen, she had asked me very specifically. She's like, "Do you want to be a designer, or do you want to be a coder?"
Oh, good
And
question.
yeah, and I really had to think about it, because a lot of the rationale for understanding why was because of coding, and but I had been presented with this question at Notre Dame too, and I think I really understood when I was doing my thesis that I wanted to be a designer. And so I was doing. I was definitely on their kind of master planning side. I was doing
Mhm.
project managing, like we were a sub consultant on the downtown Oakland specific plan with Dover Coal, and then we were implementing some of the sustainable communities like CCTA grant projects, and so mostly at the corridor planning or neighborhood planning type scale, and then if there were codes associated with that, I would work on them. Right.
Mhm.
So Tony is the coding director, and
Right.
I think for other types of codes, citywide codes, he's definitely the main person. And so for me, it was more implementing the designs that me and my team were working on. And then, most of my clients that I was working with were public sector clients, but I did, I think Dan had talked about the project in Papillion. I had worked on
Mhm.
the master plan for that, and
Oh,
was
cool.
really an assistant PM with John Mickey, who sometimes when we had like really big projects, we would actually have two PMs and kind of split the roles so that someone could really manage client relations and the other could help manage the design team,
Yeah.
especially when we were traveling a lot. So
Yeah. So I also skipped over. I probably should have spent a minute talking about, you had this experience where you went back to school and you went to Notre Dame. And I,
yeah.
and I think probably a lot of people who are not in this world don't realize how different Notre Dame is than
Oh
a lot
yeah.
of other colleges or universities in the architecture and design world. It is really, or has had this focus for a while that is really very much about urban design and even, I guess, what we would call traditional architecture and traditional urban design. So,
Yeah.
um, what was that experience like, especially piggybacking off of a very different experience at UT Austin?
Yeah. I remember, okay, so they have this like drawing boot camp or architecture boot camp the first, I think it's like a week, maybe two, I think it was a week prior to the session. And oh man, I just remember that. So we draw everything by hand. We hand
Uh-huh.
draft, we hand render, um, and to me, I mean, I know I went there, so obviously I'm going to have, somewhat of a bias, but I do learn a lot better when I'm like actually physically using my hands.
Hmm.
I also, I mean, even the same thing comes down to notes. I used to write all my notes. Now I don't, but I have to kind of train my brain to
Yeah.
be okay with typing everything. Um, but and it's just the kind of the way that I learned. But I remember this boot camp, and we had to draw line weights, and I was there. Kevin, I kid you not, I was there until 2 a.m. Okay, and of course there's like different skill sets, right? That Notre Dame only takes like 12 students in an incoming class, but they're at varying levels. So there were like a handful of people that had architecture undergraduate degrees from Notre Dame, some that had architectural undergraduate degrees that um, were from other schools, and then some that had no architecture background. And I was in that cohort. And so I'm sitting here like, I'm like calling, of course, Vernon and I weren't married at that time, and I'm calling him like crying, what am I doing here? Like I was not expecting this. And then, of course, I had to do an architecture degree, right? Because didn't have an architecture undergraduate. But I always had, thought that I was not actually going to practice architecture, that I was going to use it to really better understand urban design. And that was challenging, I mean, doing, structures and construction drawings and stuff. But I mean, all of that leads to a better understanding of the built environment, a better understanding of why we're getting, some of the built form that we're getting today, an appreciation for detail and rhythm and balance that I've always had, but it, struck me in a more emotional way instead of like an
Hmm.
understanding it. And then I, for my thesis, I did have to do a building, but I actually requested to start my thesis earlier, a semester earlier, and do kind of a neighborhood plan, and then work on one of the buildings in that plan. And I mean, I just learned a lot in my own personal journey through that thesis and postgraduate school that I think I always think about, because Um, Graduate school is an exploration. There's only so much that you are actually going to learn in your academic coursework. The rest of it is like you took pieces from it, and you really have to have this discipline or this curiosity to find out more, right? I don't
Mhm.
think academia is ever going to answer all those questions.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely more self-directed, than undergraduate.
Hmm.
It's interesting you tell that story. So, for those who wouldn't know, like Notre Dame was notorious for producing graduates that have incredible hand drawing skills and rendering skills, and it's like and I can see that. I can see that with the blog. I can see that behind you on the wall. You've got some
Yeah.
framed
Yes.
drawings
Yeah.
that you've done,
Yes.
and it's pretty remarkable. So, I want to tie that to the blog, but tell me a little bit. What would you say is like the commercial for what you're doing now, and for the work that you do? It's with Remix, is that right? Or,
Oh, yeah. So I'm a partner success manager. I basically have, a portfolio of customers. So right now I'm managing 78 kind of transit, scheduling, and streets customers. We actually have a transportation planning platform. You can do that for network design, and then assess kind of equity and access, but also do your route planning, scheduling, things like that. And then we have a street design side of the platform, and you can do complete street work, Vision
mm,
Zero, and so just based on my skill set, I'm the kind of streets liaison. But the majority of my book of business is transit, and it's funny because I started off this year managing like an ARR of 3.7 million, and it's up to 5.1 right now, and
mm,
I it's yeah. But really, we handle the post sales life cycle, right?
mm,
So helping customers define success, understanding what they want to do for onboarding, and then for retention, just making sure that you know um, we help them define success and help them with trainings, and then do project specific one-on-ones,
mhm,
and then we're kind of looking at growth and their kind of business reviews. So it's interesting because it's tangential to what I was
mhm,
doing before. I mean, there are a lot of parallels to consulting, right? Client
right,
relations, but you have to be an industry expert to be able to help customers, and then a product, you have to teach yourself to be a product expert. They see you as an advocate of the product, but they also see you as an advisor, right?
yeah,
Which is why understanding the industry, understanding their pain points, knowing how to use data, which data sets they would need, especially if they're evaluating access and equity and patterns and stuff like that. um, so I mean, and then just understanding their procurement process. It's really, a lot of people who've worked in private sector don't really understand what it takes to get things through a city or an agency,
mhm,
and it takes a long time. It's
yeah,
usually very complicated, as
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, that's. I mean, I so I was reading this book. And I'll circle back to something else too. But I was reading this book called "Steal Like an Artist." Have you read
uh-huh.
it?
I've heard of it, yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah. And so he talks about like there are two types of people. There's the person um, who can uh, basically have their career in their art, and they are okay with that. And then there's another type of person that needs their career to be something separate from their art.
uh-huh,
And I guess I realized through this journey that at least in this season, as
yeah,
Ali put it, that
yeah,
that's basically what I need. I have a 2-year old, and I also, and I think this is the reason why I've structured a lot of the things that I've structured today. But I left Opticos because I was having mental health issues and just like did not know how to really function.
mhm,
And so I needed time off, and Karen and Dan and Stefan were like really generous. I think they really tried, and we tried in different ways. But I had general anxiety disorder and major depression, and I did not know. Like, one of my symptoms was that I could not talk. Like, it was
hmm,
so bad that I could not talk to my partner. I had really bad paranoia, and I needed medication, I needed therapy, I needed
Mhm.
the tough thing with mental health stuff is like you're just testing, medications.
Right.
But I remember one day I had like started this medication and then had to go to work, and I felt like I was in a cage. It was really weird. Like, and I was like, I can't do everything, And so yeah, it took almost a year off. That was in 2017, summer of 2017, and I started feeling better. Things were starting to get better by like winter time, and but in my silence I was listening to a lot of podcasts and a lot of books. They were like my best friends. It was funny, but it got me through it. And what I started to really love was like the cross pollination of ideas, and really was kind of writing all of that down. And one day I was, having dinner with my husband, and I was like, I'm thinking about writing this book. And I was like, I think that there's a really interesting connection with mental health and urbanism.
Mhm.
And I kind of laid out this thesis for him. Right, I've gone through ups and downs before. I just didn't know that I was living with this at all until I was diagnosed with it. But it happened once in Dallas before we left, and then it happened in San Francisco. I think the difference in Dallas was we had moved to a townhouse, and it was in an area where there was a light rail station, but there wasn't really good connectivity. There were no third places. So there wasn't this opportunity for like chance interactions.
Hmm.
And when I was in San Francisco, the difference was I could take the dog, I could go downstairs, I could go to a coffee shop, I could talk to the barista for as much or as little as I wanted to. And if I didn't want to talk, I could just be immersed with
Yeah.
people that were somewhat like-minded. And it just made me feel better. It helped me lift my mood. And I'm not saying that's the only thing.
Mhm.
Obviously I went through a lot of other things, therapy and medication, all that. But I do think that, social infrastructure, third places, like what you see in your environment and what you feel through your environment has a lot to do with your mental health. And I was kind of searching for this answer while I was reading these books. And some people would maybe at the beginning they would talk about it, but then a lot of times it was the same arguments, right? Like, how is physical movement in some way helping your mental health, not
Mhm.
actually, how are these patterns directly impacting your mental health. And so I told my husband this first. He's like, you should just do a blog. And I was like, but I really want to write and paint. And I mean, I want to paint and draw. Like, I miss that creativity. And he's like, yeah, you should do it as a blog and then like see what people react to. And so then I was like, okay. And then I shopped this idea around. So like, of course I hang out at Opticos, even if I'm not working there. And I'm like, what do you guys think of this? And it seemed, fairly novel enough that I was like, okay, I'm just going to jump in and try
Yeah.
it, see what happens.
Yeah. Well, and that's really gets to one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about the blog, because it is really unique, and it does, I guess the way I might describe it, it does talk a lot about issues that you might think of as almost like spiritual in
Hmm.
nature,
Yeah.
and certainly you talk a lot about mental health, and how the design of places that you go to, how they just really touch or resonate with your emotions.
Hmm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
really unique. There's very few people who kind of write about that. And so that was really kind of where you wanted to go from the beginning, was to take that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think, one of the things that Dennis, who was a principal at Townscape, and Steve Muzan also writes about a lot, right? He talked
Hmm.
about this. But, um, it's this thought that, we the places that we love, we form attachments to them. And because we have formed attachments to them, we want to reinvest in them over time, right? That's
Hmm.
why timeless principles kind of pass on. So, this whole thought of things being lovable, like, why. What is it that we kind of gravitate towards? And so, I've always been thinking about why, but more from a rationale of like, why this standard? And so instead of asking, or why this design decision, it's like, instead of asking those questions and really kind of always digging into that, like I felt like maybe there was a time to ask different questions, and it still relates to those things, and but it's more about, why do we form attachments to these places? And what if we as designers and architects really focus more on how we make people feel,
Mhm.
right? And that is qualitative more than it is quantitative. And I think Christopher Alexander, in his book Timeless Principles, he talks about the quality that cannot be named.
Hmm.
And it's like, not everything is quantitative,
Right.
and that's okay, but that's also, I mean, you're talking about emotions, emotional research, and then it's also like the defining the emotion itself, right? I talk about joy because joy is an intense momentary feeling of happiness, but that's where we form the threads. Happiness is the culmination of these moments of joy,
Hmm.
right, throughout your life. And so the feeling of joy is actually stronger. It's just fleeting, right? It ebbs and
Right.
flows. And so, how do we relate the patterns and what we feel with, like, these things that, through various research, we've seen that there are certain patterns where we innately kind of feel connections to them in various ways. And so that, I mean, it's interesting because it's, when I started, there were a few resources, and the ones that I liked, I would kind of cross reference to what they had, and like dug deeper into the books that maybe they were looking at. And I would say, like, emotional research is pretty, like, novel, right?
Mhm.
Brene Brown talks about that there, and then I think my most recent post about the emotion of awe, um, I think even there, the YouTube videos that were coming out of Arizona State University, they were saying that it was still like really early. And so now it is harder for me to, or just takes longer for me to release posts, because I'm doing a lot more research, like
Mhm.
reading more books for every single one. um, the more and more I understand, or the more that I know where to go or where to look.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can see that. And obviously it's not like your goal is not to crank out a post, once a week or something like that. It's
I
obviously
mean, initially I had really ambitious goals, and then I was like, whoa, whoa,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. But obviously you're trying to provide something with a depth and a quality to it that you just don't usually see. And it has this combination of what, not just what you write about, but also the imagery,
Mhm,
which are often drawings that you create
mhm,
yourself, or photographs you're taking.
mhm.
And it is fascinating because if you read a whole bunch of common sort of literature about architecture, about urban planning, it does make it sound like it's like, oh, this is like you check this box and you check that box, and
Yeah,
it's like it's a science and it all works and it's
yeah,
magical. There you go, and that's all you need to do. And we forget that there's so much that's forgetting about. This is really for human beings.
yeah,
We're doing this work and creating places for humans. And I have argued with people for years that it's amazing how few of our conversations revolve around just the idea of beauty, like the importance of
yes, yeah,
beauty to humans.
mhm,
That and I used to still sometimes I'll end a presentation by saying, like, human pleasure is not a frill. Like, that's
mhm,
actually the core essence of what makes great places. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to with talking about joyful places and how they connect to people.
yeah. Well, and you brought up something that I talk about. This was one of my hardest posts to tie together, but it was the one that I did on Florence, and I had introduced this book called Together by Vivek Murthy, and he was the Surgeon General under Barack Obama, President Obama, excuse me, and now he is under President Biden. But he talks a lot about what matters most in life is love and human connection, right? And that if we think about this from the built form, it's like, we have timeless elements of our buildings and our places that are aspects that we love and we form attachments to, right? And that we have this vital need for social connection, right? These emotional responses come with memories, typically tied to a connection that you've made. And those relationships are really essential, right? And there are like 3 degrees of those. But really, like loneliness and this epidemic of loneliness is, what we're dealing with, what people kind of don't feel in the I mean, definitely feel, excuse me, in the suburbs. And they don't necessarily have these places where, you have kind of a deep, there, you have kind of 3 degrees, right? Your closest people, your partner, and then your family and your friends, and then this third one, which is like a community of people where you share interests, right? Like chance
Mm-hmm.
interactions. But the other thing that I've had a hard time explaining to people, and even to myself, to really kind of get this message out, it's definitely a remembrance of Phil Bess here. It's an Aristotelian principle, but it's basically that we find balance beautiful, right? And that that balance is basically this beauty that alludes to a balanced inner self that we describe as happy, right? That we are constantly striving to achieve. And so when we see that in our environment, we're trying to resemble that balance that touches us with their beauty. And I mean, I remember reading that in Architecture of Happiness. I remember um, thinking about it when I was doing the Florence post. I'm like, this is not an easy concept to
Mm-hmm.
tie built form patterns with this understanding of beauty and a balanced inner self. And
Yeah.
but that's what buildings really give to us.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot about, the time that, we spent living in Savannah.
Hmm.
And there were two things that always really stood out to me from just our years living there, which is, it was amazing how, I don't know the best way to describe it, but it was like you could just walk around and there were just moments you had where you would just catch yourself and, be like, my God, this place is so damn beautiful.
Yeah.
And it,
Hmm.
it was hard to describe, but you could have that experience daily. And it was just
Yeah.
obviously not just the architecture, it's the combination of everything. It's the landscape. Uh,
Hmm. The
and
trees. Yeah.
yeah, and it was an amazing experience living there. And I think the second thing that I always took away that I felt like if I ever did sort of neighborhood planning scale stuff again, that I really learned was just I think I always knew the importance of public space
Hmm.
from a more abstract sense doing
Hmm.
work. I don't think I had entirely at all a full appreciation of the importance of public space until we
Yeah.
lived in Savannah,
Hmm.
which has abundant public
Hmm.
space, at least in the historic part of the city.
Hmm.
And if I were to draw a plan of Savannah for a developer, it would look like it has just like way too many squares and public space, and it looks too
Yeah.
expensive to maintain and everything else. But it's remarkable how you find that it's all different, it's all used, it all
Hmm.
has its own personality. And because it's so rich in public space, people really do walk around
Yeah.
and you have all of those informal social connections that you were just talking about. Like we would constantly just go out for a walk and you would run into somebody you knew.
Yeah.
And that's an amazing emotional
Hmm.
connection to a place.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot too, for 2 reasons. One is, I wrote this post during COVID, and it was about San Francisco and basically seeing the joy in ordinary moments and re-enchanting walks where you appreciate something that is actually giving you that emotional connection. And so to me in Savannah, when I think about the public realm, it's always the double height stoops.
Mm.
They're so fascinating, and of
Hmm.
course the side yard buildings. I mean, you just can't get
Yeah.
over them, right?
Yeah.
And anytime you see the streetscape with the trees, like you know that you're looking at Savannah, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And and so, it's just, thinking about, right, it's so easy to walk through a city like Savannah, a city like San Francisco, and just like not notice the public realm or the background buildings because of the balance and the rhythm. You're just the harmony, right? You're just used to it.
Right.
And then it's another thing to really, really think of, like, what are the things that you're gravitating towards? And
Hmm.
to me, it's frontages, right? And it's streetscape that I love. But then, the what you were talking about with open space, I wrote this down because CNU has done such a good job with streets, right? And especially when you're working, like when we were working on the downtown Oakland specific plan, it's like, you really have to think about the streetscape because the land values are too high to really think about like surface level open space, right? But Eric Klindenberg talks about the need for social infrastructure, right? And so gifts to the street, open space, right? And then community buildings, things like that are all, like third places, are all part of social infrastructure and help us see empathy and connect with people. And so, um, you know, I feel like open space has always been the one that people let go of in implementation. And like you were saying, it's expensive. It's, you have to think about maintaining it,
Hmm.
all
Yeah.
those things. But we lose sight of the need for surface level open space, and so many ordinances allow for private, like balcony space and rooftops, to be counted towards their open space allocations. And so we lose service level open space, right? This was happening in Oakland, this was happening in Seattle. And we talk about the range of open spaces based on the context and the environment, but it's really, implementing them, because I think that's the most important, like one of the most important parts of, social infrastructure. And the reality is they don't have to be that big, which is
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
sometimes is the most surprising. But it's also, I think, one of the things that we really should be focusing on, to so that we have the infrastructure that we need within the built environment, and to have a really strong public realm.
Yeah. So one other question comes to mind. I guess if you don't want to answer this, you don't, if you don't feel comfortable answering it, don't. But I am curious with the history you had and the combination of the mental health struggles plus your interest in cities and this realization that getting out and walking around was really good for you.
Hmm.
Was the COVID era? How was that for you? Was that hard? Was that especially hard?
um, no, and I'll tell you why. Because one, I mean, at that point, I had gone through a lot of this,
Mhm.
and even though, I mean, time does heal a lot of things,
Right.
right? So I don't feel the same kind of pain points that I used
Mhm.
to. But one of the things that I really had to get over was, I mean, it was definitely a personal journey, right? Because I think Stumbling on Happiness, other books talk about the fact that our brain, as a survival mechanism, remembers negative memories stronger than positive ones. And so for me, when I was going through depression, right, your brain tries to rationalize why you are so bad by pulling all of these memories, right?
Mhm.
So you have to like reverse engineer
Mm.
all of that out during therapy so you don't feel that way anymore, right? And that's untangling that is really hard. Um, during you know during so the reason I've kind of set this up, then I call it my mental health egg basket, right, is that w- my triggers were basically that I was tying my entire self-worth to my job and my
Mm.
success, right? And I think that I just had to learn that's not true, right? And a lot of that year was like, well, I'm not working and I'm still doing, like, I'm having a great time,
Mhm. Mhm.
and so um, so one of my eggs then is the blog, because it is a fully creative space for myself, right? It fills my cup in a way that nothing else does. And even if I was doing project work, you don't get to design and draw and paint that way, or freely think, in the same way on project work. You're still constrained in different ways. um, but then I knew that I wanted to practice, and take projects on. So I wanted to have the job in tech that was separate, so that I would get something consistent, but then also be able to do project work. So luckily, I mean, even though the projects didn't like start right at the beginning of 2020, that's when I basically started working in tech and could actually kind of
Mm.
implement this structure. And so I was actually really happy. I take 1 to 3 projects a year, um, and really just focus on working with people who I've worked with before, who know the value that I can add. And sometimes that's as a sub consultant, sometimes it's an extension of staff. I've done both, of the design team, basically. But so far, since 2020, I've been able to kind of hit that goal and have really enjoyed being able to do those things. The tech side, so what I learned when I was a sole proprietor is I do not function well alone. And so I don't want to be a full on sole proprietor, because I think that I don't know if I mean, at least right now in this season, it's like building that pipeline and all of those things. It's just a little too much for everything else that I have going on.
Yeah.
Um, and it takes a long time for projects to land, and so you really are doing that all the time. But if I was at a firm, at a higher level position, I would be project managing plus marketing plus business development plus designing, or managing a design team. So really, this is just a different way of allocating my time that hopefully gives me, and it does give me the balance that I'm looking for. Last thing about COVID, but that's when our baby's an IVF baby, and we had gone through this, retrieval and implant
Mhm.
process, and then we finally, uh, um, did that during COVID. Well, we're
Mhm.
not doing anything else, we were, inside, um, but yeah, I mean, so it's been, uh, I know that COVID was hard for a lot of different reasons, like
Yeah,
not being able to see as many people, but also being in San Francisco allowed us to see, our kind of close friends in public spaces. I never felt alone.
that's good.
The only thing that I really did miss was not being able to see our family, because we used to almost, it was almost like every other month
Yeah,
we would see them, and then like it just kind of all stopped. And I think that was harder.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, the other thing I want to ask you about, one of your more recent, couple of posts, you had this really interesting, and unusual journey going to Paris,
Yes.
for the summer or for an extended
Mhm.
period of time, right? For like 2
Yeah.
or 3 months?
We were there for 6 weeks.
6? Okay, 6 weeks. Okay,
Yeah.
so talk about your decision to do that and with your infant, or your
Yes.
uh, and what prompted that and
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I read this book called "I Will Teach You to Be Rich" by Ramit Sethi. Have you read it?
Uh-uh.
I see you smiling. Okay. Um, uh, so it basically talks about, having a rich life and basically a purposeful life that's, where you build it around intention and your values. And so, we really thought about like what this meant for us. And I think at the core of it is basically having a freedom of choice, right?
Mhm,
Freedom is really important to us. Us, not just me and my husband, but us meaning as a species, right?
mhm,
And so I think, so we defined a few values. One was renting in a dense walkable area, right, where we could have a certain level of flexibility. In San Francisco, we didn't have a car. In Dallas, we have one car. Obviously, working remotely,
mhm,
helps a lot with that. Um, and then picking a home base, right? We chose to pick a home base near family. Our parents aren't going to be around forever, and for the phase in our lives where they are, we want to be near them, and we want our kids to
yeah,
be near them.
mhm,
And then the other one was, we love travel and exploration, but I think I talked about this a little bit, but what the move to San Francisco for us was a risk, right? We had just spent all of our cash in a house. Like we literally left 6 months after buying
Mm.
that house. If any slight thing went wrong, it would have been like, we would have been back and probably living at home, it was like, um, but also those risks kind of push us in a way that it just takes us out of our comfort zone. And I think what we decided was that we wanted to live, like truly immerse ourselves and live in another place, and that we were going to try to do that every year. Um, I think we did say that it was going to be for a long period of time. I think I pushed too hard, too fast with my husband. And, Paris was a lot for him. It's funny because, I lived in Rome when I was at Notre Dame, and I knew what living in Europe was like. He didn't know. And so I think I mentally was way more prepared for that. Also, I think what I realize now is like we were mentally like preparing for that trip like during COVID, right? So we had a lot more time to really think about it. Um, and so I think moving forward, we will still try to do it every year, but it may not be for the same duration. I think this year we're mixing in, like we're doing Manhattan for 2 weeks, and we're basically going to
Mm.
be in Brooklyn. But we're taking the time off. We're not working remotely during that time.
Yeah.
I think next year might also be domestic. And then I think every 3 years is a good cadence for international, at least based on what I did when I was a kid, right? I used to go to India, and we would spend 2 to 3 months in India. I mean, it's definitely doable, but there's balance in it. And I remember at the beginning of this year, it was like, whew, we were thinking about Carmel in
Yeah.
California, but it was hard to find housing. I mean, I was in and housing that we in the area that we wanted to be, and it was turning out to be more expensive than being in one of the best neighborhoods in Paris. I mean, it was
Mm.
just, and then the other values were kind of building wealth while living in a city, which is hard,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
living debt free, which I think we kind of achieved a couple of years ago and have been trying to. We do want to get a house but in the M Streets, which is one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Dallas. Obviously, I think we've put in 6 offers, and we
Mm.
none of them have been accepted because it's just a highly desirable neighborhood. We've had a lot of influx of population, and it's like the only neighborhood that has a good elementary school and you can walk to a coffee shop. So
Oh, yeah.
it's just
Yeah.
like, I mean, it's not like
It's
huge criteria,
no,
but
it's the little things.
yeah, exactly. Um, but so I mean, I think one of the things that I started to realize when I put these values together, and what I talk about when I've done a couple presentation, or actually a number on this topic, and usually when I'm talking about patterns and relating it to mental health, at the end I talk about, basically like, how do you pull this, why are we pulling this all together, why does this even matter, and really thinking about it more as a call to action and how can it be applied. But all of these values are actually really hard to achieve, and they're hard to achieve because and I know this study, but there was a ULI study in 2015 that said that 50% of the population desires to live in a walkable environment.
Mhm.
And then Smart Growth America just released another study recently that said only 1.2% of our metropolitan land area consists of walkable patterns,
Mhm.
right? And that just, the lack of supply makes these environments like unaccessible for the majority of the population,
Yep.
right? And I think it really limits our freedom of choice, right? So coming back to the fact that that's really what delights us, and we are constrained
Yeah.
because we're not able to access the places we want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. I think I may have emailed you when you started writing about Paris, because it had just kind of reminded me and inspired me a little bit. I know my wife and I had talked for a while, like after we had our little ones, that
Mhm.
we had this ideal life in mind where we would take off, like every summer we would go live for a month or two in some different
Yeah.
place and just immerse ourselves in it. And we haven't, you know, we haven't really done that. In a certain sense we have, I guess, because we've built a routine out of going to Maine every summer for a week or two to be around her family and to just kind of be there for a while, which has been great. But it's not quite the same as, going and living in either a foreign country or another city for a while. And
Yeah.
so it was cool, really cool to read that you guys were doing that, and kind of reminded me that we should talk about, is that something we really want to do,
Yeah.
and how do we do it? It certainly gets more complicated when kids are school age,
Yeah.
but it's a
Yeah.
unique deal.
Totally.
I know there are a lot of people who do it, and there's
Hmm.
a lot of people in that whole financial independence community who really do it.
Yeah.
So I just think that's a cool experience. How was it for the little one?
Oh, well, okay. I mean, I thought it was great. I was just tired a lot, you know, because we had we I got really lucky. One of my coworkers at Remix, her nanny during COVID, actually went to graduate school in Paris and had finished her master's um, right before we got there. And so she was kind of like in between school and looking for something. And so she was watching Justin, and she would watch him from 3 p.m. to like 9 p.m. Um, and so we would work. We would still work normal U.S. hours, but then we would wake up in the morning because
Hmm.
what you don't know about Paris, what I didn't know, is that it in the summer it doesn't get dark till like 10 p.m.
Yeah, yeah,
and
yep.
then it gets light really fast.
Hmm.
So they these babies are not going to be sleeping the whole time that they normally do, and so he'd wake up really early, but it would be our chance to kind of explore the city. So we'd be out around 7:38, and then we'd be out till like 1, 2 o'clock, come back, put him down for a nap. And then, when he woke up, we would be working at that time. So it worked out. It's just that, yeah, I mean, you're working until like 1, 2 in the morning, which
Yeah.
is really hard. And then, um, we were staying in a one bedroom. And so right, my baby's like has his own room and is sleep trained. That's, important. And
Yes,
so, but
it's
we were
very important.
co-sleeping, and I was like, "Oh, this is not for me." I definitely was sleeping on the couch a lot. Um, but, but yeah, I mean, I honestly, I mean, everybody says this that would look at my husband's stories or whatever. They were like, man, he was just living his best life, right? Eating a croissant every morning. And it's so funny because I'll give him a croissant here and he won't touch it
Yeah.
unless it's from like certain bakeries. I was like,
Hmm.
dang.
But
That's
yeah, not to mention that that croissant in Paris was like 50 cents, and here it's like $5,
yes, yeah, it's
That's
$5.
crazy.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
it's amazing. Well, that's really cool. I mean, I guess, they call it the city of light for a reason, and,
I mean, it was just
people forget how
beautiful.
far north, it actually is, and
Yeah. Well, and the other thing was, before I loved, I mean, I had spent a lot of time in Italy,
yeah,
and I don't
right.
think that I had gone to Paris a few times, but I still at that before going, my preference was still Italy. But then being in Paris, it's such a livable place. And I think a
Mhm,
lot of it has to do with the public space, right? The open spaces, even the way that they treat you with kids, like,
mhm.
it's just kind of like, it's so they're so accepting of it in ways like you go to restaurants even late at night and it's totally fine. um, and it just felt a lot more livable
Yeah,
than my experience in Italy.
yeah, yeah.
So
It's the most livable large city in the world.
mhm,
I
yeah,
mean, that's been my experience. I'm curious, what kind of feedback do you get, on the blog from other people?
yeah. I mean, usually it's kind of similar to when you email me. It's like, oh, either how did you do that, or
Mhm,
or I think a lot of people actually resonated with the awe post,
mhm,
the one in Paris. Um, Sometimes it's just that they're inspired by something, and they write back because they went through some experience. I remember another kind of friend of mine. who knows my journey, he's like, it's so interesting that you found beauty back in urbanism, that was really what kind of pulled you out. And he thought the same thing for himself too, when and he had gone through his own journey.
Mhm.
um, and I think it's just like pointing out things that are beautiful and associating it to an emotion. I think just people aren't as used to it, and I think that's just what resonates, because a lot of times it's a lot of data, and we're
Yeah.
obviously trying to prove a lot
Yeah.
of what we're doing to council members, to the public. But I've always found it fascinating when I talk to the public on projects and things like that. um, they understand the emotional connection way more
Hmm.
than the data.
Yeah.
And that's why usually when you're doing a visioning process and you're curating photos that people love, things that they want to emulate from that place, it always is typically these patterns. And I think when I started this, I wanted to test what resonated with normal people, not
Yeah.
in the industry, but just, how can I help my friends who live in urban places actually express why they love that place? So then if they want to advocate for something, they know what they're advocating for. Um, and uh, and really testing to see how that resonates. So sometimes it's the writing style, sometimes it's the way that I draw. Like, I don't erase anything, I just keep going. Jim Richards taught me that.
Hmm.
Right? Just the mistakes make it beautiful. Or sometimes if I'm rendering something and I finish, and this is a quality of Notre Dame, but it's like it's too perfect.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason it feels static, even with the mistakes in the line drawing or whatever. um, and so, like, putting confetti, right, putting multicolor like splashes on the drawing just make gives it more movement, makes something that's imperfect perfect,
Yeah.
because it's not exactly right. And so a lot of it is just trying to understand what gravitates to people. I haven't had a lot of, I mean, to be honest, people can definitely critique me all day long, but I don't feel like people have gone that direction. I was definitely afraid when I started the the blog, and knowing, obviously what the new urbanist community and intellectuals are like, and going through, crits in architecture school. I mean, it was just like I was scared,
Hmm.
but at the same time, like, this is my space, this is my creative space. And there's a lot of content out there, you can choose to read it or not, but it's just that you know, it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable, to put ourselves out there from a creative standpoint. And the reality is, we're all doing it.
Hmm.
And I think that's the hardest part of what we practice, is like, we're so emotionally invested in what we're doing. And some people can do that and some people can't, right? Like, it just depends on what structure. But I think that's the reality of our profession. And so I definitely respect, when people put out content, because it's hard. You're putting a piece of yourself out there,
Yeah.
and you don't know what you're going to get back.
Yeah. I think that's probably a great place to wrap. I think that's really well said, and I definitely encourage anybody to check out Joyful Urbanist and Arti's writing. It is very very unique. I was delighted to see it when you first started writing and
Oh,
putting it out
thanks.
there, and I've really enjoyed what you've put out. And like I said, it's one of the really cool things is that you're not really trying to crank out like content every week. So the things you put out really have a lot of great thought, and they're organized beautifully on the page. So it's
Oh,
really
thanks.
really great stuff. I expect at some point there will be a book out of all this.
It's funny because what Christopher Alexander, in A Pattern Language, he says at the beginning of the book, he's like,
Yeah.
somebody should rewrite this. This was done in the '60s, and I'm like, ooh, challenge accepted.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah.
But also the challenge is, like, basically a book then not reading as just a series of blog posts, which
Yeah.
I think
It's
is
actually it's really a great way to
challenging.
think about, potentially creating a book is using a blog as a way to, create your content and test it and put it out there. So,
Yeah.
um,
It's also a journey, a long journey, you know? I
yeah,
mean, that's like it's not I think I mean, now thinking about it, the amount of research, I remember this one woman who was writing a book saying, it took her 10 years and she had kind of started with the blog too. And I was like, yeah, I get that. I get it now.
yeah, yep,
I
no
didn't
doubt.
understand then. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even the book that I wrote, which was published in like 2014, I mean, I think I originally had the idea for that at least 10 years before I wrote it.
Oh, yeah.
And so it was just, a lot of it was, when am I going to find the time to actually sit down
Yeah.
and write it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it just took years before I could really collect my thoughts uh, and then find the time to actually execute it. And then
Yeah.
once I did that, it all came together pretty quickly. But it's just a challenge, especially when you're a busy person, you've got a life and you've got a family and everything else. It's
Yeah.
all a challenge.
Yeah.
All right, so I do like to ask people as I wrap, since
Yes.
this is the Messy City podcast. If you have a place, a neighborhood, a city or town that is sort of a favorite that meets that description, or what would you have on the list?
Yeah. Um, so I was thinking about this and I I love seeing moments where you can tell where the evolution in a city has happened. So I'll use San Francisco and a couple of neighborhoods as an example, but we lived in Soma, and we lived a block south of Market, and I remember that um, fronting an alley there was an old fire station, and it was this wonderful short shop front, 2 to 3 stories, right? Totally vacant, and then you have these high rises that actually front kind of the main thoroughfares, but it's just this quiet moment where that the city has kind of evolved around this and that the scale was so different at one time. um, and then you see that same moment in Pacific Heights on Union Street. You've got these Victorians with shop fronts at the ground floor, and they front the main thoroughfares. And then there's this one moment mid block where there are all these carriage homes that house kind of artist studios, and it's quiet, but it's like this oasis with landscaping and other things, bikes. It's just
Yeah.
it's just such a special place. And then this last one, same along the same street, but it's a Victorian, but they have taken the garage and converted it to a coffee shop. And it houses Wrecking Ball Coffee if you want to look at it on Google Earth, but it's awesome. And I saw the same pattern in Seattle in these areas where there's a slower evolution, right? The city is not necessarily like pumping money into these places, but it's just this quiet evolution of starting to mix uses. And I don't know, it was one of my favorite moments in the city.
So it seems like, continuing a theme, you love the imperfections.
Yes,
So,
I really do, but
yeah,
that also
as we all
follows your theme.
yes. I like the way you put it earlier about the sort of the perfect nature of imperfections, and so
Yes.
it's really a cool way to look at life, and you look at yourself, and also just look at the things that we build. So,
Mhm.
uh, thanks for doing this. Really
Yeah,
appreciate catching up with
absolutely.
you, and take care.